mind-body interaction goes both ways.
So I argue that the substance theory also can better solve the identity challenge of explaining how you can be the same being from moment to moment. Now, I'm not suggesting that the external world is a simulation. I'm not suggesting that it's not either.
These are some of the most difficult conclusions for me to accept. If perception is a window into reality, then how is that reality beyond us observer dependent?
If a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to experience it, my answer is not only doesn't it make a sound, it doesn't have a shape, it doesn't have a size, and the tree doesn't even exist. Okay, that is my answer. so so
Hello and welcome to the discussion. This channel is here to serve as a platform for thoughtful conversations about God, philosophy, religion, history, music, and more. My name is Nahoa, and I'm here to ask questions, to seek truth openly and critically, and to share the journey with you. Some of the most fundamental questions we can ask are related to consciousness. It's often been noted that on the one hand, consciousness is mystifying when we try to analyze it, but on the other, it's perhaps the most familiar phenomenon to us. It involves all our experiences, all our thoughts, feelings, desires, etc., properties of which we are already aware. Still, we need to ask, how are we aware of anything in the first place? Even deeper than that is the question, who or what are we? Are we neurobiological systems? Are we spirits within bodies? Moreover, how can conscious beings like us arise? Right? What is foundational to mental reality and reality in general? Is it the physical or the mental or somehow both? In this conversation, we'll dive into the philosophy of mind, where there are so many opportunities to clarify our consciousness and our existence. The scholar joining and teaching us today earned his bachelor's degree at Arizona State University, his master's at Biola University, and his doctorate at Notre Dame. Currently, he teaches philosophy at Azusa Pacific University. His focus is on the fundamental nature of reality, so he's published on theories of truth, on necessary existence, on the existence of God, and most recently, on the nature and origins of persons. We'll actually be doing a giveaway contest for a copy of this wonderful book, Who Are You Really? With that said, and without further introduction, Dr. Joshua Rasmussen, how are you?
I'm so great. Thank you for having me on. I love that introduction. That was just beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just it got me all curious to engage with the conversation. So I'm very, very excited to talk with you about this topic.
Yeah, and I'm honored to have you on, like I said before we came on, and to sort of introduce our path of understanding. Let's talk about some tools of inquiry. So, along with, and indeed prior to scientific inquiry, introspection and reason are valuable tools we can use. So, in your book, you describe the field of philosophy as sort of a dark, mysterious cave. And so, if we uphold that metaphor, how can reason and introspection illuminate our path?
This is such an important question because before we investigate any topic, we need some tools to use to investigate the topics. Now, in this case, I mean, in your introduction, you talked about how we even know anything, right? Like, how are we aware of anything? This is the question that we want to understand. Like, what is the nature of consciousness? Consciousness gives us access to reality. It gives us knowledge. Like, if I'm conscious of you, or if I'm conscious of my thoughts, this gives me knowledge of reality. Well, this is already leading to a puzzle because I want to investigate the nature of consciousness, but I need some tools to know how to know the nature of knowledge, right? And this already is leading us into foundations. And I think it is helpful to sort of start with something concrete. I mean, here I've got a water bottle here. It's a little piece of reality. And somehow we're able to talk about this piece of reality. We're able to describe its shape, its color. We're able to investigate it in some way. And well, how do we do that? You might think, here's how I know about the water bottle. I'm using my eyes. My eyes are seeing the water bottle. Well, of course, if you're watching this, your eyes aren't actually seeing the water bottle. You're seeing pixels on a screen. And then somehow you're inferring that there is a water bottle there in my hands that is getting represented by those pixels. But how are you weaving in? how do you infer that there's anything behind those pixels? Like, how do you know that those pixels aren't just randomly generating an experience of a water bottle? Or how do you even know that there are any pixels outside of your own experience? Like, so maybe right now, those of you watching this, you're just having an experience of me talking, and that experience is all completely in your own mind, in your own consciousness. How do you know there's anything that's beyond your consciousness that is even producing your experiences? And that's where reasoning comes in. I mean, reasoning is a tool to extend your light beyond your direct, immediate observations of your experiences to inferences about what may be causing those experiences. And so I think of reason as sort of investigating the natures of things by awareness of connections between certain relations, certain natures, and then their relations to other natures. And so an example of this would be your experiences right now of thoughts and feelings and images. And then you infer that there's a cause of these experiences. And that inference is based on using reason to think about a probabilistic link between your experiences and a cause of that. Now, immediately, this question about how you can infer that there's something external to you leads into complex questions in the nature of perception that I'm not going to go into here because we don't have to analyze or resolve those questions to sort of appreciate that without reasoning we'd be completely in the dark about anything in science or in history that extends beyond our current present observations and experiences. Reasoning extends our knowledge outward. So that's one of the important tools is the tool of reasoning. And a lot of people who know my work, they know that this is a tool that I try to utilize a lot. And sometimes people are worried that I lean too much on reason. I think part of the worry there is that reasoning can be used in ways that sort of rationalize prior beliefs, and that rationalization isn't necessarily tracking truth. Reasoning is fallible, and I want to just acknowledge those things. In fact, in the book, I acknowledge that there's a kind of epistemic or a humble stance that we can take towards all these tools. We can admit that we could be wrong, and I think this is why humility is so important, and seeking other people who may disagree with us to kind of help us check our blind spots is very, very helpful. But just because we can make mistakes with the tool doesn't mean you can't use the tool at all. And so part of what I invite the readers to do is just to take up the tool of reason and to utilize it and see what they can see by that tool, see what they can infer, see what they can figure out. So that's one of the tools to help us. And then the other tool, and this is perhaps sort of the principal tool for the book on consciousness, because this is the tool by which you become conscious of your own consciousness. This is the tool that kind of helps us with that puzzle that I talked about, which is like, how can we even begin to know about the nature of knowledge unless we already have some tools? But how can we know what those tools are without knowledge of the tools, right? So there's already kind of a circularity problem. How do we get knowledge started? And I think we'll talk a bit about this because this is related to some of the barriers to introspection, or some of the skeptical motivations for skepticism about introspection. But the basic idea here that I'm thinking of is that introspection is a tool that you have to look within, basically to be conscious of things that are most immediate to you. This will include your experiences, your thoughts, your feelings, your intentions. Those are things I think you can apprehend through introspection. And in fact, even science itself, I think, presupposes a kind of awareness of states within you. That science itself involves two things I talk about in the book. One is making predictions from observations, and second, making observations that you can then share. Well, in order to make predictions from observations, you have to be, I think, aware of inference relations within your own mind. You could read them on a page, but then what you're reading is being decoded in your own mind, and then you're aware of that through introspection. And then also, in order to share your observations, like if you observe a tree, then in order to share that, you have to be somehow aware that you've observed a tree. But the experience of observing a tree, see, this is what people miss sometimes. There's a difference between seeing a tree and then being aware of you're seeing a tree. That takes another kind of power. And the awareness that you're seeing a tree, that's an awareness of an experience state, a state of seeing, or state of consciousness, let's say. It's the consciousness of seeing a tree. And so this is where I would say that introspection is also a tool that we can use. In fact, it's sort of implicit in our knowledge in other domains, including empirical science. It's kind of bedrock in the activities of science. Introspection is. So sometimes I think of consciousness as kind of like the window that we look through to see reality, and then we forget that there is actually a window there, and we can also look at the window itself because it's also part of reality. And we can talk more about how we might do that. But that's my summary of those tools. And I think with those tools, we can go really, really deep into the cave of consciousness. And that's my invitation to the readers. Let's just pick up the tools. Maybe you're a little skeptical about what we can do with these. That's okay. Let's just see what we can do, and let's see what light we can bring with reason and introspection.
That's a helpful starting point. And you mentioned how introspection and reason, they're not just valuable in the subfield of the philosophy of mind, but in a variety of different disciplines. And even I was thinking as I was reading your book that when I was dealing with all sorts of emotions from one extreme to the other extreme and everywhere in between, I think maybe the mark or a mark of an emotionally mature person could be introspection, right? Are you
Mhm.
aware of how you're feeling and why you're feeling it, what your goals are, what your desires are, and the root of them? And it can just be healthy in everyday life if someone asks, how are you feeling? Oh, you look down and you have no idea why. To gain clarity on your own mental and emotional states via introspection could just be good all around.
No, absolutely. I have a sister who's a therapist, and
Mm,
this is the number one tool she uses with her clients
really?
is introspection, and she shows them how they can use it to get free from addictions. She works with people who have trauma and addictions that can result from that, and she would tell me story after story about how she's giving them tools that allow them to pay attention to different aspects of themselves using introspection. So I'm so glad that you brought that up because yeah, this isn't just a philosopher's tool to investigate the nature of reality. This is very, very practical. I mean, you can really change your life paying attention to, what are the states within you that make you excited? What are the states that are bothering you? Just being aware of those things, paying attention to that. What are the states of you that are ashamed of other states of you that are hiding from other states?
Mm,
Bring them into the light so you can integrate, so you can manage your states. Yeah, my sister, she says there's no bad parts, but sometimes parts get at war with each other, and so
mm.
every part has a work to do, and you use introspection to be aware of your parts and to bring them together in that work. So yeah, you just press on something that can get me very excited too, because these tools that the philosopher can use to investigate the nature of reality, we can use those tools in very practical ways. I think sometimes people think of philosophy as just idle speculation, and it's like, I mean, hopefully this work in philosophy can actually help people in very practical ways. And the tool of introspection, I mean, I defend its utility. I defend how I think it actually can give you knowledge of reality, realities within you. And I think that's so important for practical reasons as well. So thank
Yeah,
you
I
for
mean,
bringing that up.
no, yeah, you're welcome. And being a reasonable, introspective person is just good in general. Um, you've talked about, you've defended the use of reason, and I've spoken to Dr. Michael Humer about how we can know anything, and I've talked to Joe Schmidt about reason. But if we focus in on introspection, some thinkers throughout history, and including contemporary thinkers, such as Dr. Knight Dunlap a while ago and Dr.
Yeah.
Daniel Dennett right now, they argue against the reliability or even existence of introspection. And so what motivates them to be skeptical of this tool?
This is such an important question because I think that what happens is there can be a tool that people can use to get treasure, but sometimes that tool gets abused. It's sort of like the person who's advertising on YouTube that you can make $1 million in 5 days or whatever. Follow my formula, and maybe there's something there, maybe there's not. And when there's abuses, it's hard sometimes to sift through the abusive uses and then to find actually there is some treasure here. What is that treasure? And so I think introspection is sort of like this. Now, I didn't put it this way in the book, but you inspired me to read Dunlap's article again. I cite that in the book, but because you prepared some questions for me, you sort of inspired me. Well, let me just look at this again and just have a look at his arguments. And I think really there's a cluster of different worries that come up. I have three that I want to point to. And these are worries that different philosophers, such as Daniel Dennett, and then way back when Dunlap was writing, but the worries that Dunlap comes up with, so his article was in, I think, 1912. I still see those same worries coming up in contemporary articulations. So I think that there is a treasure that introspection can reveal, and then there are barriers to that treasure. And I want to put light on those barriers and see if I can kind of roll them away a little bit here. So one of the barriers has to do with, Dunlap talks about, well, first of all, what is introspection? Like, what is it? And then how do we actually know that it's actually revealing anything? Okay. So what is it? And he goes through some different articulations of what it is. And one idea that I think is connected to the idea that I have in my work, the way that I think of introspection, is it's actually just this conscious awareness of things within you. And what do I mean by things within you? Well, I don't necessarily mean like spatially within. I mean the things that are states of you. Like if you're in a state of thinking, then you can be consciously aware of that state of thinking. So states of you. And perhaps parts of states of you will also count as things within the domain of introspection. So now, having articulated this notion of introspection, Dunlap wants to know, well, how can you be aware of awareness itself? Okay, how can you be aware of awareness itself? And I think there are a couple worries connected here. So one worry is a worry that I mentioned in the book, which is just it's kind of a psychological report if somebody says, well, I've never been aware of awareness itself. So because I've never been aware of awareness itself, I have no good reason to think that awareness exists. And so now I'm going to appeal maybe to scientific evidence to see if there's some kind of empirical reason to posit awareness, right? And then maybe this is where Daniel Dennett will say, well, we have another story that we can tell about brains. We don't need to posit awareness itself, okay? Or some aspects of awareness that Dennett would be more skeptical of. I mean, Dennett might say there is awareness, but what it is to be aware is can be understood in terms of brain activity that you can sort of see in the spatial domain. But if we're talking about a state of consciousness that isn't reducible to things that you can see in the spatial domain, it's just this awareness, this experiential quality. Then what Dennett's going to say is, well, maybe we could posit that sort of quality to explain certain things, but we have another story that can explain those things. And so we don't really need to posit this extra stuff. That would be one kind of skeptical worry. And then Dunlap is going to have a similar sort of skeptical argument here, that we don't have a reason to posit awareness. He says in there that he's not been aware of awareness itself. Okay. Mm-hmm. And David Hume, I talk about him later in the book. He has maybe a similar kind of worry about whether the self, okay, is ever a content of a conscious experience, all on its own. Like, so I'm just self-aware, and that self-aware just is a sort of pure self-awareness. That there's not an awareness of thinking or a feeling or something else. And so what Hume is kind of pointing to there is that there's always some other impression that's like connected to that self-awareness. And so there's no need to have this additional thing in addition to your impressions, the self. Okay. And these are kind of different angles of sort of the same worry that I'm trying to point to, which is that we have got no good reason to believe that there is a kind of introspective consciousness. Okay. There's no good motivation to believe that. There's no sort of scientific evidence for it, and there's no other kind of evidence for it. So that would be one kind of worry. And what I want to say about that worry is that the only way that I know to dispel that worry is to actually just be aware of your own awareness. So this is sort of difficult in a way because the question is, well, how do I become aware of my own awareness if I've not been aware of my own awareness? And then how do I roll away sort of barriers to believing that I am aware of my own awareness in the cases that I actually am aware of my own awareness? And for me, this is just kind of how it works for me. I start by being aware of something. Okay, so let me just do this right now. So I'm going to put out my hand here. I'm focusing on this finger here. And now I'm focusing on my experience of that finger. I'm removing the finger from my visual field and I'm focusing on my memory of having experienced that finger. So you call it what you want. I'm calling it a memory of having experienced it, but it's something. There's something there that I've got in my mind, which I would use the language of. It's a memory of having put my finger there. Okay, now I'm doing this next thing, which is I'm attending to the fact that I just reported that I was focusing on my memory. And in that experience of noticing that I just reported that I was focusing on my memory, I come to be aware of my having noticed my memory. Okay, I got to do it because now this is all fading into the past. I got to do it in the present moment. So right now I'm aware. Okay, it's hard to talk about it while I'm doing it. Let me just do it so I can really get this clear. So I want to tell you what I'm actually experiencing. I don't want to make up stuff here.
Yeah, I'll do it with you.
Okay. You can do it with me. Okay. It's easier for me to get a visual image than a memory. So I've got a little image going. I'm focusing on the image. Now I'm focusing on the image. When I said that I was focusing on the image, I said that because I was actually aware, not just of the image, but of my focusing on the image. So I became aware of my focusing on the image. The focusing on the image, that focusing is a kind of awareness. It's like kind of active awareness. So I believe that what happened there is I became aware of my awareness of an image. So I think Hume's right that there are different impressions of the self. Well, let me back up here. He's not going to put it quite like that. He's going to say there are different impressions, and there's no impression that's just of the self.
I see.
But my interpretation of that is that you have actually different acts of self-awareness that include different aspects of yourself. So I'm aware of myself thinking, I'm aware of myself feeling, I'm aware of myself intending. I'm aware of my own awareness of myself. You can do that. And I think that is just the most direct way to respond to the skeptical worry that there's no such thing as self-awareness or introspective awareness. It's just to become aware of your own awareness. That I think is the most direct way. Now, in the book, I also argue that introspection is implicit in science. I already kind of mentioned that in terms of knowing that you've made an observation. It almost gets self-defeating to say that introspection isn't reliable because the very concept of introspection comes from self-awareness. Not self-awareness, but I mean awareness within your consciousness. So awareness of states of consciousness, which is what introspection. That's what I mean by introspection. It's sort of awareness of states of consciousness. So if you turn off the light of introspection, I call this the darkness problem. Like everything gets so dark that you can't even be aware that you're in the dark. You can't even be aware that you're doubting introspection because doubts occur in your consciousness. So I think those are also important considerations. But going back to obstacles to introspection, so one of them, the first one here I'm mentioning, is no good reason to believe it. And I've tried to respond to that by suggesting that you can be aware of introspection directly, and there's self-defeating problems if you say there is no introspection. The second kind of worry has to do with like what it is that's doing the introspecting. So sometimes people have suggested to me that the thing that's doing the introspecting is awareness itself. So awareness becomes aware of awareness. And this is like a mirror that sort of sees itself through another mirror, and you have like an infinite mirror scenario because the mirror is seeing itself in another mirror, and so it's like in the mirror, but then it's the same mirror that's seeing itself, so it's got like infinite mirrors. Um, this is rough because it's kind of rough in my own mind, how to really sharpen this particular worry. But I think there is a worry here that accords with something that I actually agree with, which is that awareness cannot be aware of itself in that same act of awareness. I do think there are certain self-reference problems that happen if awareness gets aware of itself in that same act of awareness. So, but my solution to this here is, well, I've got two things. First, I want to be careful. And even just saying that I don't think awareness can be aware of itself, I mean, that itself is something one could question. I mean, because things can be related to themselves, like everything's identical to itself. So self-relations aren't in principle impossible. So why can't there be an awareness of awareness? That. So anyway, there's room to explore here, even though at the end of the day, I myself do think that awareness can't be aware of awareness in that same act. But then my solution is to say that there's something in addition to awareness. There's you. You're the thing that has your awareness, and then you're able to have your awareness of thoughts and feelings, etc. And then you're able to have an awareness of your first awareness of thoughts and feelings. You just have another act of awareness of your first awareness. And there's not a circularity there because it's actually a new act of awareness of the original awareness. And so I'm not saying there aren't other questions that could be brought up here, but I do think this solves a certain set of worries about how it's possible. I think Dunlap was kind of pointing a little bit to this kind of problem of like how you get awareness of awareness. So that's the second barrier. And the third barrier, I already mentioned this one. This was Hume's worry about the idea that there's no impression that is just of self. And so you could say similarly, there's no impression just of like introspection or just of awareness. And there I want to say, even if that's true, that doesn't mean that there isn't awareness or that there isn't yourself. Because what that just means is that awareness involves other elements. Self-awareness involves awareness of self as something. But that awareness is sort of like the key ingredient in all of those different acts of awareness. And so, yeah, so those are a few things I have to say about rolling away some barriers to introspection.
Thank you for that. And now I think we can maybe put some of this into practice by zooming in on first-person experiences, including feelings. So
Yeah.
how should we feel about feelings? How and what can we think about first-person sensations? How do we compare these experiences to the neurophysiological states to which they are connected? Because you of course don't deny a connection. You would just question. You would question the inference from connection or correlation to origin or to causation, and much less identity. Anyways, how should we feel about feelings, and how should we see their relationship to the physical states to which they're connected?
I think we should love feelings. That's my feeling about feelings. And to your question, I brought this little prop to kind of help us think about it. So, here's a piece of reality. It's green. It's got a certain shape. And, one question we could ask is whether the green of this object is the same as the shape of this object, or whether the green of the object is different from the shape of the object. Okay, now this is like one of these basic questions. It's like so basic, it's almost hard to even understand. Like, why are you asking this? And like, it's just obvious, right? You just see the green and the shape are just not the same. Um, but it's helpful to think about, what is it that allows us to see that they're different? And I think there are a few different answers one can give, but I want to suggest that one of the strongest answers, the strongest ways of knowing, is just by kind of direct comparison of things that are within your consciousness. So if I have green in my consciousness and if I have a shape in my consciousness, I can directly compare them and see difference. Same thing like for numbers, if 3 is different from 4 or 3 is different than even triangle, those are different things. 3 is different than the emotion of loving you. Well, how do I know that? Well, because I've had the emotion, I've been acquainted with that emotion of love. And then I've also been acquainted with shapes and numbers, in my mind. So I can like directly compare them and see that they're different. And then what's important here to notice is that you can have things that are different that are still connected. I mean, the green here, I can rotate this around. The green is connected to this thing. The green is moving across space, you could say, as I'm moving the shape. And as I move the green across space, the shape moves along too. So there's a connection there. And I think I like how you put that. There's an inference sometimes people make from connection to identity. And I want to be careful with that because sometimes there are things that are connected and correlated in deep and intimate ways, but they're not necessarily the same thing. Like, so for example, even like a triangle has three sides, it also has three angles. Well, being a side and being an angle, those aren't the same property. And so being triangular and being trilateral, being, having three sides, those aren't the same property, even though they're so integrated. And so this is like one of the kind of the first key distinctions here is between being correlated and being one of the same, and then offering this, I call it direct comparison test, where you can directly compare certain aspects of consciousness with certain aspects of brains and see that those are different. Those are different things. And so example that feels clear to my mind would be shape. I think that you can see that the feeling of love and the shape of a triangle just aren't the same. And you can see that by direct comparison. Now, my one caveat here is that sometimes there'll be theories of shape that involve certain theories of perception, where, according to these theories, you aren't actually directly consciously aware of shape, but instead there's something outside your conscious awareness that causes you to have shape experiences. Um, and so, like, if you have an experience of a cube, that experience is completely in your mind, and so is the shape that you're acquainted with. And then outside that experience is a reality that we'll call cube, but its nature is completely unlike the nature of the sort of cubical qualities that you have in your mind. And so then on this theory of perception, I would be too quick to say that um, the feeling of love and the shape of, let's say, a cube aren't the same thing, because maybe the shape of a cube is something that's completely different than what I'm imagining it. It's outside my conscious awareness. The shape of a cube is. It's the thing out there that causes my experience of a shape of a cube, but the experience is different from the shape. And so maybe it turns out that the shape of a cube actually is the feeling of love, but I just don't know that because I don't have direct access to the shape. It's sort of like if there's something in your closet and you don't know, you haven't looked in your closet, okay? But the thing that's in your closet causes you to have a certain feeling because it makes a noise or something. And well, okay, this isn't actually a good example because obviously your feeling is not in the closet. But you could think of an example where you're aware of something like a shoe, and then that shoe gets thrown into your closet, and now you're not aware of that shoe anymore, and you don't believe the shoe is in your closet, but you just don't know because you're not aware of what's in your closet. So I want to just really point out here that the direct comparison test only works if you can actually directly compare these things. And then what I say in the book is that if you can't directly compare these things because something's outside your consciousness, it's like the shoe in the closet or the cube outside your conscious awareness, then you can use a different tool. You can use reasoning now to deduce that the stuff that's outside your conscious awareness is not the same thing as that which is in your conscious awareness, just by the law of non-contradiction. It could be that part of it's in your awareness and part of it's out, but the very thing that you're not aware of can't be the same as the very thing that you are aware of, because again, that would just be a contradiction. So, that's why, like, if you're aware of this piece of reality, if you're aware of the front side of it, but you're not aware of the back side, okay, and maybe the back side has some special properties that you're not aware of, then you can deduce that the backside is not the same as the front side, because the backside is not in your awareness, but the front side is in your awareness. And so now you can use that tool, because if it turns out that the cubical shape is not in your conscious awareness, but your feeling of love is in your conscious awareness, now you can infer that the feeling of love is not the cubical shape by another tool, by reasoning, to avoid the contradiction. So it's like this is an abundance of riches situation, because either the cube is in your conscious awareness and then you can directly compare them and see that they're different, or it's outside your conscious awareness given a certain theory of perception, in which case you can deduce by the law of non-contradiction that that which is outside your awareness is not the same as that which is in your awareness, and so therefore the feeling of love is not the cubical shape. And I'm using cubical shape just because that's kind of a clear example. People can kind of think about that. But I'm going to argue that changing the complexity of the shape is going to make no difference to the use of these tests. including people sometimes talk about functions. They say, well, consciousness is not a shape, it's a function. It's like, well, functions are just sets of inputs and outputs. And so you can use the same test to say, okay, an input cube and an output square, it's not the same as the feeling of love, again, because I can be aware of the one without the other. So that would be kind of one of my reasons, not my only reason, for thinking that certain aspects of consciousness within your awareness, like love, feelings, aren't reducible to certain aspects of brain activity that are outside your conscious awareness.
Now, to illustrate these principles, you talk about a cubical shape, or you use that prop. I don't know what that is. That green
Yeah,
thing.
I make this choice.
There you go. But one could see these examples as maybe too easy or too trivial to extrapolate from those and say that, for example, an intricate nervous system couldn't produce sensory experiences. Of course, as you say, you don't build entire arguments solely based on
Yeah.
those intuitions. But if you were to say maybe that AI robots could never feel some sensation, then our intuitions wouldn't be as clear there. You could still make a potentially good argument against the possibility of AI mentality, but it seems somewhat more natural to think a complex functioning system with capacities to transfer, process, and respond to information could be conscious. So what do you think of this, and what do direct comparison tests, reason, and introspection reveal about this?
Thank you. I'm so happy for this question. This is a very common question that I get, and it helps me to make some important distinctions here. So, first of all, I think we need to distinguish between um, what can produce consciousness from what can have consciousness from what is
Mm.
consciousness. Okay, these are three importantly different questions, right? Because it could be that I think using a metaphor here will be helpful. So let's just imagine that there's some water in a river, and the water represents consciousness. Okay, and let's say that there's some rocks in that river as well. And there's some interesting correlations between the rocks and the motions of the river. So you move the rocks around, then the river, the waters in the river are affected. And if you splash the water hard enough, it kind of rolls those rocks around. So there's an interesting correlation. And then now somebody could say, um, look, I actually think that those rocks produced the water. Okay, now we could talk about that. We could think about, well, is that possible? Could rocks do that? We could investigate that question. Um, but that's still a different question from those rocks are the water, okay, or are states of the water. That's a different question. Or that the rocks have the water, and that's almost hard to even say exactly. But the rocks are the things that sort of have the watery aspects. And what I want to say here that is that the direct comparison test doesn't tell us what could produce consciousness yet. So in the second part of the book, I start to investigate what could produce consciousness. And I really, really want to separate that question from the question of what is consciousness or even what could have consciousness. Just because clarity on the one question is so important for clarity on the other. So go back to the rocks in the river. Let's say somebody had this theory that rocks are actually a certain state of water. So this might sound a little bit strange and unexpected, but when water comes into a certain form, that form is what a rock is. Okay, this would be a reductive theory of rock to watery states. Now, on that reductive theory, if somebody asks the question, well, could the rocks be produced by the river? The answer would be sort of easy in a way because we already see that rocks are a state of the river. And so all the river has to do is produce certain states, and thereby it produces certain rocks. So that's how you can sort of answer the construction question of how do you construct the rocks out of the water on a reductive analysis of rocks in terms of states of water. But now if somebody comes along and says, I actually have a direct comparison test, or I've got some arguments against reducing rocks to watery states, then that's going to kind of open up another set of questions about how the rocks could be related to the water. Um, and so it doesn't answer every question, but it does kind of help to maybe remove one kind of answer, which is that, you know, going back to consciousness now, some people say consciousness is produced by the brain activity. And here's how the brain activity does it. Consciousness reduces to a certain type of brain activity, neurological activity. And so when the brain enters into that particular state, it thereby produces consciousness because that's what consciousness is. And what I want to argue here is that the direct comparison test is a good reason, I think, to think that you can't reduce consciousness to things, you can't reduce elements within your consciousness to things that are not directly within your consciousness. So if I'm having a thought right now, like I'm thinking about some zebras, there's aspects of that thought that are right within my consciousness. I can tell you about the aboutness. There's maybe now a little image of a zebra that's forming. There's these aspects within my consciousness. And I don't have the same kind of conscious awareness of neurological activity in my brain of any complexity. So changing complexity is not going to be relevant to this particular argument. And this argument, I think, is enough to show that the that there's a problem with the reduction, while still leaving open whether you could produce consciousness out of brain activity. So that this would be like maybe the water could produce rocks, and it's a further question how it does that. And so I want to kind of leave that open. We can come back to that pretty quickly if we want to. I know there are other questions on your outline here that will help us think about the second question, which is how do you produce consciousness? But I think here it's really important to separate how to produce consciousness from what is consciousness. And so, yeah, so my answer to the complexity question is that differences in numbers of parts, you know, the complexity of the shape isn't going to be relevant to making that categorical shift from being not conscious to being conscious in terms of what consciousness is. It'd be sort of like taking a bunch of pine cones and then adding them up. And by adding them up so much and organizing them in a certain way, they thereby form an abstract object of being the number 9. Um, the pine cones, you know, I'm not saying there's 9 pine cones. I'm saying the very abstract number being 9 is identical to some elaborate complexity of pine cones. Like complexity does not account for the category difference. So I hope some of that is helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. So to try to just encapsulate that, if we're asking the question not of construction but of identity, what is consciousness, then it doesn't matter how complicated the thing, and you're trying to reduce consciousness to a physical state or a physical system. It doesn't matter how complicated the system is, because you can still apply those tests, right? So let's take,
That's it.
a mental memory, right? A memory. It is certainly connected with and correlated to a pattern of neuronal activity. But if you're asking, well, is your memory that pattern of neuronal activity? If you can be aware of both, then you can directly compare them and see differences. For example, the memory has a first-person felt aspect to it, while the neuronal activities, it's analyzable in terms of third-person spatial descriptions. And so if you're aware of both of them, you can directly compare and see differences. And according to Leibniz identity law, if they're different at all, then they're not identical. But if you're not aware of both, right, you're aware of the memory but not aware of the neurons firing in your brain, well then there you go again. Like they're not identical because you're aware of one and not of the other. So would
That's
that
it.
be an accurate application of what you said?
Yes, that is very, very well put. Better than I put it, to be honest. So that was great. Yes, thank you. Yeah, and the one note to add here is that in the case where you're aware of your memory and not aware of the neurological activity, it's there's a certain kind of awareness which we could call introspective awareness. And sometimes people will say, and kind of in response, they'll say, well, maybe you're aware introspectively of the memory, and then when you look at the brain, you're aware via another sense of the same thing. It's just like two different ways of being aware of the same reality. But I want to just make sure it's very clear that there's something missing in that, which is that in order to apply Leibniz's law, all you need to show is that there's one thing different. So if I'm introspectively aware of my memory, then if that memory is neurological activity, then I am introspectively aware of that neurological
Right.
activity. And so it's not enough to say that, well, maybe I'm aware of the same thing from another method of awareness, from another sense, because in order for them to be the same thing, everything has to be true of them both. Whatever's true of the one has to be true of the other, including my very mode of awareness. So if I just want to say it again, just for emphasis, like if I'm introspectively aware of a memory of swimming in an ocean, then if that memory of swimming in an ocean just is some particular spatial activity or function of activity in the hippocampus region of my brain, then I am thereby introspectively consciously aware of that hippocampus, piece of spatial reality. And but I'm not. I mean, I'm just not. If somebody says,
Right.
well, maybe you are introspectively aware of it, well, then I've lost my grip on what you mean by
Mm.
introspective awareness, because introspective awareness is something that when I have it, I can then even be aware of my introspective awareness to tell you that I'm introspectively aware of it. And I'm not aware that I'm introspectively aware of neurological activities in my brain. I'm just not. But I am aware that I'm introspectively aware of certain memories. And so I feel like it's just to draw it out to that level of detail, I think is really important, because let me just say this: some arguments, they have a simple form, and then it's only their simple form that can be persuasive. And then you take off the hood and you see the complex engine and you realize it's a bad engine. It just doesn't work. This is the word. There are people watching this who have this where you've had this experience. Apologists are selling bad engines covered by shining hoods. And then if you open up the hood, you find out actually that engine just doesn't work so well. And people who've really looked into this know that. Um, but there are other arguments where maybe there's a certain kind of a hood and you look in and there's a certain engine that looks good. And then you look in further and it actually is even like better, like the more you look into it, like it's more special. And I just want to say, like, this has been my experience with this kind of method of inquiry using direct comparison. When I first heard the argument early in graduate school, I thought it was question begging. I thought it was kind of like not connected to science in the right way. These were thoughts that I had. And then I began to look more and more into it. And then there were some objections. I thought, well, that argument's not as good as this one. But let me just say, like, the argument has grown on me. Like, the more I've looked into it, the more it seems like this argument's actually really, really good. There are other arguments where I've looked into them and they've kind of weakened in my mind. They've sort of fallen apart. It's like, yeah, it's not really that great of an argument. But this argument is not like that. And I want to just say that because this argument is one of those that I find in sort of the popular sphere, and even sometimes in academic context as well, can sort of get dismissed based on maybe a level 1 or level 2 round of objections. And I mean, if you read the Stanford Encyclopedia on the knowledge argument, you'll see that there's a dialectical path that goes pretty deep. And I would take the path even beyond what that Stanford Encyclopedia does there. In fact, I think what I offer in the book in some ways takes the path a little further, or at least along it, kind of along certain angles that I think can be very helpful.
Well,
So
no, for
that's all I've got
sure.
on that. I feel like your summary was really, really good. So and just adding that complexity and detail, I think, can encourage curiosity for people watching this.
Yeah, yeah, it's definitely encouraged my curiosity. So let's keep exploring. Next, let's talk about thoughts. Right? You note really interesting features about thoughts that I had never thought about. So thoughts are unique in virtue of their intentional character, right? They can a thought can be about something, but a microphone can't be about anything. So it's intentional. It has a certain logical structure. It's able to form logical links with other thoughts, and it has truth value. It could be true or false. Now, one of your biggest innovations to the philosophy of mind would be your counting argument. And so let's discuss it. I can put the syllogism on here. This is from your article, I think, called Building Thoughts from Dust, a Cantorian Puzzle. So maybe we could go premise by premise, or however it's your argument, however you'd feel it's best to explain it.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so this is kind of an argument strategy for analyzing the nature and foundation of thoughts and their properties. And I have a variety of different forms of this argument. So this is kind of, I think, one of my earliest versions, and I've continued to develop this argument. And actually, I've got an unpublished innovation that I'm very excited about. I keep extracting like new applications and like new insights of this general strategy. But just at the kind of big picture level, the strategy is to see if there's a property of thoughts that wouldn't be a property of physical states in terms of their quantifiability. And so I end up following Cantor into the land of infinity. So, Cantor is a mathematician who helped us kind of understand that he helped us understand infinity. And one of the things that he helped us to understand is that there's a way of demarcating certain infinities from other infinities. So, for example, we have the numbers, the whole numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way up. There's infinitely many whole numbers. Then we have the decimal numbers, which include, all the real numbers, so like 1.2, 1.257, all the decimals. And Cantor showed by a kind of famous argument that the infinity of the decimal numbers is larger than the infinity of the whole numbers. There's not a kind of a one-to-one mapping both ways. And so what this does, it kind of opens the door to a kind of argument where you can show that there's a certain category of things that's different from another category if the one category has a greater infinite quantity than the other one. So if we could go back to the slide and we could sort of step through these premises here, what I want to try to show here is that the quantity of logically conceivable physical states, I'm thinking physical states here as either analyze in terms of spatial states, or if we want a broader notion of physical, analyze ultimately in terms of states that aren't themselves conscious. Okay, so particles, fields, these things, let's just assume for sake of argument, aren't themselves conscious, and then they can organize to form complex brain states, and then those brain states could then facilitate consciousness, right? So the first premise here is about the physical properties, and it says here that for any class of physical properties, so just any collection or class or group of physical properties or set or plural of physical properties, call them the P's, there's a conceivable, or let's say non-logically contradictory mental property of thinking that those P's are physical properties. Okay, this is an example of a mental property that we can correlate with a group of physical properties. So, for example, if we have like some staplers on a table, each stapler has all sorts of physical properties. Take some class of physical properties of those staplers, and then there could be a mental property of thinking that those physical properties are physical. Okay, so that's the first premise. And I think a way of motivating that is going to be based on just understanding the meaning of what a mental property is through. Now you got to use some introspection to understand, okay, what is a thought? Well, thoughts are about things, so we can form a thought about physical properties. And so this is going to allow us to form, without a contradiction, a thought about any set of physical properties. And I want to really just emphasize, this premise is not saying that these thoughts are physically possible. It's not saying that these thoughts are actually in existence. It's merely saying that these thoughts or these mental properties of these thoughts are, we can describe them without a logical contradiction. We might call these coherently conceivable, in the sense that there's not a contradiction in the description of them. So, okay, so that's the first premise. And the second premise then tries to help us go from the first premise to the grand conclusion. So the second premise is that there are more classes of physical properties than there are physical properties. Now, I mean, my preface for this whole argument is a pretty abstract, pretty advanced argument. Premise two is from Cantor's theorem. So Cantor showed that some infinities are bigger than others. And in particular, if you have any sort of infinite class, then the class of all the subclasses of that class is going to be an even bigger infinite class. This is sometimes called the power set. The power set of a set is bigger than the original set. So Cantor gives us premise two, And so then from premise 2 and together with premise 1, we can now go along the path to the conclusion. So premise 3, or number 3, is a conclusion. There are more mental properties than physical properties, right? You can sort of see that by the transitivity of more than, right? So there's at least as many mental properties as classes of physical properties. There's more classes of physical properties than physical properties. Therefore, there are more mental properties than physical properties. And then from here, we deduce something about the actual world, which is that not every mental property, like the property being a thought, for example, that would be a mental property, is going to be a physical property. And again, we can use Leibniz's law here. I mean, there's something true of the property of being a thought that's not true of the property of being a physical property, which is that the property of being a thought has more possible instances than the physical property. So there's something about you that's not going to be characterized purely in terms of these physical properties. Again, using physical in a way that is going to be not as broad as another notion of physical that allows mentality to be a fundamental physical feature. So I'm understanding physical here in terms of fundamentally mindless states. So this is a counting argument against reduction, reducing mental properties to physical properties. And this would be a different argument from the direct comparison argument.
Right, and this is one of the more technical things we're discussing today.
Yeah.
But in terms of its structure, it's actually quite elegant, right? So for every class of physical properties, there is a mental property, and there are more classes of physical properties than physical properties, so there are more mental properties than physical properties, which means that being a mental property is not being a physical property.
Yeah.
And that goes against many, if not all, many kinds of reductionism, including type identity theory, which is that being a mental property is identical to being a physical property. And so this counting argument, at the very least, to be modest, could prompt a reductionist to reassess and reconsider their views. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I itched to just clarify something that I said that I think was a little bit of a glitch, actually, which is that the conclusion there is that not every mental property is a physical property, and that's because in the class of the mental properties, that's larger than the class of the physical properties. But we're talking about conceivable mental properties, right? And so then there was a question about, well, how do you go from conceivable mental properties to mental properties that you actually have? And what I want to just clarify here is that there's the property of being a mental property, and then there is the property of being a physical property. We can see that those aren't the same. There's also the property of being, one of some subgroup of physical properties, right? Because you might think that, somebody who's a type identity theorist might already agree that being a mental property isn't the same as being a physical property, but they're going to say that there's some subgroup of possible physical properties that would be mental properties. And what this argument shows is that even that's not correct either. That there isn't that reduction. Again, because there's more types of mental properties than types of physical properties. So anyway, that may be sort of like a minor little clarification or detail, but I'm sort of a stickler for those, and I was the one who kind of led us down a path I wanted just to clarify that. So, yeah.
No, yeah, nuance is important, so I appreciate that. Usually when I bring up a guest's argument, I have some objection that I carefully and charitably phrase in the form of a question. This one,
Yeah.
I don't really have a critique. As I was reading your article, I thought, well, what about? And then you addressed my objections in the section where you reply to challenges. So I'll link I'll link your article in the description, and it's in your book. So I'm thinking now we can move on to another feature of consciousness, which would be mental causation. Right? So many philosophers and psychologists and scientists acknowledge that mind-body interaction goes both ways. The body can influence the mind, and the mind in turn can influence the body. So Could you please illustrate this for us and expand upon the significance of mental causation? Yeah, guided by the sort of questions as, does the mental affect the physical, and what are the limits of the mind's influence on the body, or perhaps even over external phenomena? Like, can the mind affect things beyond the body? This is just, what does science reveal about these things?
Yeah, this is great. So I love what you say about two-way causal interaction. So, I mean, to illustrate the body affecting the mind, me experiencing your voice in the physical world and then seeing the pixels on the screen stimulated my eyes, my visual cortex, which caused my brain activity to somehow allow me to have some understanding of what you're saying, and then lead me to have certain thoughts that are connected to that understanding, and then to form a desire to do something that I'm going to do next, which is to illustrate the mind over matter. I'm going to show you that in a moment, but first I just want to say here we have an illustration of matter affecting the mind, the material world affecting my thinking, giving me an understanding. Now I'm motivated to go in the other direction. So how do you get mind over matter? Well, here you see my mouth is moving in correspondence with a desire that I have to share certain thoughts. So that desire to share certain thoughts is having certain physical effects in the world. And I think this has become extra striking to me lately when I would think about the precise link between certain intentions I form in my mind and then certain physical things in the world that I can predict ahead of time. So let me just play this out for you. So I'm going to predict that I'm going to lift my pinky finger, this one here. I'm going to lift it. And I'm going to lift this finger. How many times should I lift it? I'm going to do it 7 times. Now, that's a very specific number. It's probably not going to go up 7 times just by chance. And I'm going to do it within the next minute. So that's a time frame. Now, this pinky finger has not lifted in our whole interview. So it's going to go up 7 times within the next minute. Like, that's a very specific and unlikely event that just happened. How do I know that? Have I looked at the brain chemistry to know that? Oh, it's doing it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Am I wrong? No, 7. Okay. I was able to predict that physical configuration in the world because I had knowledge of something in my mind without even knowing about the chemical reactions or brain activity in my brain, at least not consciously. It looks like the thing that I'm consciously aware of is what I'm going to call a mental state, something, a state of my mind, of intention. And there's evidence here that the intention made some difference to the physical world, resulting in this effect. Now, people will say, well, correlation isn't the same as causation, right? That's true. But correlation is often evidence for causation. And this is where I think we have really good evidence for two-way causation, causation from body to mind and from mind to body. And the evidence is certain kinds of systematic correlations where, where you're investigating, okay, well, what are the possible causes here? Well, I'm aware of my mental states. I'm aware of my intentions. That predicts these certain effects. Those effects happen. And so now what's really important to realize is that there's many ways of analyzing this two-way causal interaction. And so that's part of my project in the book, is to provide an analysis. But here, just to say that I think we have really good evidence from our own experiences. Yes, there's all sorts of scientific evidence. I mean, this is not sort of an obscure, let's say, deeply controversial fringe science. That this is kind of widely recognized in the domain of empirical science, that there's things that you can do in terms of gratitude that can affect your mental health and your brain. So there's a whole literature on positive psychology. Not to say that there aren't places where there's questions or even abuses of that literature, or places where there's more controversy, but just to say that as a general idea that the mind can affect your body in various ways, there's all sorts of many studies I could point to illustrating this. But
One
I
of the
like to give
studies
the
in your,
yeah,
oh, sorry, go
please
ahead.
do.
One of the
Well,
studies in
just
your book.
I like to
Oh,
give
my bad.
the sorry. There's kind of a delay back and forth now, but
Yeah, yeah.
just I like to give the example with the hands, just because people can test that for yourself. You don't have
Right.
to kind of wait for the science. You can just do your own experiments, which is ultimately what science is based on, right? Is people doing experiments. So yeah, but please.
One of the studies that you reference in your book is It's entitled "Mind Does Really Matter: Evidence from Neuroimaging Studies of Emotional Self-Regulation, Psychotherapy, and Placebo Effect." And one of the focuses of that paper shows how uh, psychother- how psychotherapy can actually affect the structure of your mind, and the phenomenon of neuroplasticity, the phenomenon of the placebo effect, where you believing something can help you actually helps your body. These show that mind does affect the material world. And so you can do an experiment for yourself, and then you can see more advanced scientific experiments that show it's not just the material affecting your thoughts and beliefs, but your beliefs, thoughts, and desires, intentions affecting your own body.
That's it. You got it.
So
Yeah.
I was wondering if there's any evidence that the mind can affect even the probabilities beyond your own body. Um, I've seen the suggestion of that as I'm inclined to dismiss that, although I'm open to it. But is
Mhm.
there? Do you know if there's scientific evidence that maybe something like the law of attraction, right, where you kind of wishing for these things to happen and thinking positively can affect external probabilities?
I do have some studies that I reference in the book pointing to some of this. Um, there's some studies coming out of Princeton where they were doing some research on consciousness affecting remote machines, and they apparently found some statistical probabilities. I looked at the primary data. Sometimes people have secondary impressions about these studies, and it looked like in the primary data, it seemed promising. I mean, there were some published works on that, and then there's been some more recent developments where they fine-tuned some of these studies and found statistical correlations between um, gr- um, like groups of conscious beings, like groups of people, and then certain effects in the world. Now, I want to kind of be careful with these because sometimes I think people can replace clearer evidence with less clear evidence. Like, so I
Mm.
think the clearest evidence is that you can affect the world from your local consciousness that goes out and kind of propagates outward. You can write a letter to a friend, and then you can affect things millions of miles
Mm.
away from your body through local, cause and effect. I think there is evidence of non-local cause and effect from consciousness, and I think this evidence is very interesting. It's not as clear to my mind as the
Okay.
evidence from local cause and effect.
Okay, I appreciate the distinction. So we've gone over some problems and problems with reduction and problems with understanding. Not necessarily problems, because that has a negative connotation, but challenges for
Yeah,
understanding, maybe puzzles, and your solution, even that might not be the best word, but your solution, yeah, you call
yeah,
it the substance theory, right? So if not reduction, a lot of people say perhaps emergence explains how conscious aspects arise. But you say that appealing to some vague process called emergence doesn't immediately solve the problem. It merely labels the mystery. Now,
yeah,
I don't know if I heard this from you or someone else. It was probably you. That let's say you see water spouting from a stone, and you're wondering
yeah,
how does that happen? Someone next to you says, oh, it's emergence. The water's emerging from the stone. Well, okay, I can see that, but how is that process of emergence occurring? And so you're just
yeah.
pushing the question back. Now, with your substance emergentist solution, you try to make that idea more precise. And so could you tell us about your substance theory and what its strengths are, how it solves the let's see, do I have it? Yes, how it solves maybe the interaction problem, the
Oh, good.
construction
This is great.
problem, the
Yes.
problem of unifying aspects of consciousness, and your persistent identity throughout time and throughout changes in your neurobiology.
I love this question so much, and I'm grateful to see this list here because I was just thinking, okay, I want to motivate the challenge, as you put it, the challenge. If consciousness is not reduced to forms of brain activity, rocks aren't reduced to states of water. Then there's this further question of, well, what constructs the consciousness? How does it come to be? And what I want to do is consider some different theories and then offer my own theory and talk about its advantage over these other theories, right? So I take some time in the book talking about these different problems of building a conscious being merely out of mindless bits of matter. And this problem is not just a problem of getting something different or something new. Sometimes people say, well, I mean, emergence happens. It's like, yeah, I agree, emergence happens. If you see a rock, like you said, producing water, another metaphor I like is rats coming out of rocks. Okay, the rats are emerging out of the rocks. You just see them emerging, right? What does that mean, that the rocks alone explain the emergence of the rats, or is the full explanation greater than that? And so what I do, and this takes some work. It's hard to even summarize succinctly because it does take some work. And for me, I feel like the problem of emergence with mindless materials, this is one of those problems that kind of it began to loom larger and larger and larger as I began to see different aspects of the problem. So you have on the board or on the screen here the interaction problem. Here we just talked about the problem of mental causation. So let me just talk about that interaction problem, and then I'll have a brief note on construction and then the binding problem. Oh, I can mention identity as well. I'll try to do these briefly. So with the interaction problem, there is a problem of understanding how the mind could cause any difference to the material world if the mindless bits of matter are pulling the strings on everything. It's sort of like if you imagine these marbles are just rolling around and bouncing around, and the forces of physics govern the motions of the marbles. And then let's just imagine that there's a mental state that is able to somehow come from those marbles. It's a mystery how that happens. Okay. But then there's a further question. How does the mental state now act downward, like onto the marbles, to make the marbles go on a different path? That's a special situation. And what I'd make an argument here is that if the mindless marbles are pulling all the strings, that's going to causally exclude. This is Jaegwon Kim's argument from causal exclusion. That's going to causally exclude the mental from making its own difference. It's like if you wish for those marbles to form into a heart shape. Okay, look, I wish for these fingers to form into a heart shape. Okay, look at that. Look what happened there. The bit of matter over there turned into a heart shape. That's because my mind has some power to do that. Um, but if marbles are moving along and there's no mind that has any power to change their direction, then if you wish that those marbles form a heart shape, they're not going to do it. It's just probably not going to happen. If they do, it's not because the mind actually made the difference. It's kind of a coincidence. So I would argue that using just purely mindless bits kind of leads to that causal exclusion problem. That isn't to say that you can't sort of come up with a story about how new causal powers just emerge, but that just brings us back to the question: how do they emerge? The construction challenge is about explaining that emergence, and this is sometimes known as the hard problem of consciousness. The idea is that there's no way to sort of explain how you get conscious mental behavior merely out of unconscious non-mental behavior. Philip Goff, he's an interesting philosopher who's done some recent work on this, and in one of his recent books he talks about how if you can't even describe a phenomenon in terms of X, Y, and Z, then you can't explain that phenomenon in terms of X, Y, and Z. If you can't even describe it. So if you can't even describe consciousness in terms of mindless states of matter, then you can't explain consciousness in terms of mindless states of matter.
That's good.
Yeah, so I thought that was actually helpful myself. I was like, that's pretty good. And that so now if you just pause it, it just emerges. You just say, you know what, those rats just emerge out of those rocks. I can't explain the emergence of those rats out of those rocks. They just do somehow. Okay, you can posit magic. Okay, but just understand I'm using that term magic. You can posit a primitive emergence if you need to, but I want to reduce the primitive emergence. I want to reduce the magic as far as I can. I actually want a theory that explains the known in terms of the known. And so this is going to actually lead to my substance theory because it's going to involve known things that I identify in the first stage of the book that's going to explain other things in terms of the known. So just to finish this list, and then I'll give you my theory and how I think it helps in this list. We've got the binding problem. So the binding problem is about how you can take different things together, even if they're conscious things, and bind them together into a single perspective. So like you've got some thoughts over there, I've got some thoughts over here. You've got some feelings, I've got some feelings. But I've got a perspective that puts together my thoughts and my feelings into one unified consciousness. I'm aware of my thoughts and feelings together, even without being aware of your thoughts and feelings. So I'm binding my consciousness together, and that's a whole other thing to explain. Even if you have a bunch of conscious bits of sand, how do you bind them together into a unified conscious perspective that's conscious of all those bits at once? If you put your head on top of my head, you start merging your brain inside of my brain. Okay, you still have your conscious perspective. I still have my conscious perspective. Merely spatially locating our heads closer together is not by itself going to explain that unification of consciousness. So what I suggest is this substance theory, which is my way of pointing to just you. Okay, you are a being. That I argue you can be self-aware. You can be aware of yourself having thoughts and feelings. And that self actually organizes and unifies your consciousness into a single field. So now we're not explaining the unification of consciousness in terms of mindless bits. And we don't have a known mechanism for explaining that. Instead, we're explaining the unification in terms of something that's known directly in our experience. Namely, we can experience a unification of consciousness that comes out of the spring of our own selves. We experience that, I think, just in consciousness. We experience ourselves having unified experiences. And so this is where I think the substance theory then can provide a deeper explanation of emergence. So I'm not saying there isn't emergence. I'm saying there is emergence of consciousness, and it emerges from a certain kind of substance, a being or a self. The self is sort of the foundation for its consciousness. The consciousness is a state of a certain kind of substance, a self. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that towards the end here, about a sort of a no self theory. But this is my theory that can explain how consciousness emerges in terms of yourself, and it can then explain the unification of consciousness. It can explain how you can have causal influence over the world through directing your thoughts, directing your intentions. And then finally, the fourth thing on that list there was identity. So there's the identity problem. These aren't all the problems I talk about, but identity is another problem. And this has to do with understanding how you could be you from moment to moment, even as the different spatial parts of you change in and out. You lose atoms, and you're at, just very, very briefly, I talk about the teleporter experiment, where you get into a teleporter and your atoms are duplicated on the planet, and then your original atoms, let's say, are just scattered or destroyed or whatever. And then the idea is that you move onto the planet because your atoms are duplicated on the planet. And people say that there's a problem there. I wouldn't want to get on that teleporter because here's the problem. Let's say you go on the teleporter, there's a malfunction, and your atoms aren't duplicated. They are duplicated on the planet, but your original atoms aren't destroyed. So now you have duplicate atoms arranged in the same way to duplicate your psychological experiences. But there's not actually two yous. There's actually one you. The question is, where do you go? Are you on the planet, or are you on the teleporter? And what I want to argue is that there's no way of answering that question merely from a third person description of atoms and their motions. You have to have first person access to the treasure box of first person data. The first person data is the data that you can be aware of. You're aware of yourself here and then here and then here. And there could be a duplicate, but you're not that duplicate. Other people might not know. They might not be able to tell because they only have access to third person facts about the spatial positions of the bodies. But you have access to something special. You have access to what it's like to be you. And what this suggests is that a purely third person description of all of the spatial aspects of reality and their relations is not enough to explain or to account for this additional first person bit of reality of what it's like to be you and what it's like to be you having an identity from moment to moment. So I argue that the substance theory also can better solve the identity challenge of explaining how you can be the same being from moment to moment, because a substance is something that can endure through change. And it's if it's not analyzed in terms of the spatial aspects, but it's a deeper reality, a self or a conscious being, then there's no problem with the transporter. It's like you get on the transporter, they duplicate your atoms. They haven't thereby duplicated you. The only way to duplicate you would be to somehow take you, what you really are in your essence, and copy that. But how could you do that? Because then you just have a duplicate. You're one being. And so those are four classic problems, and I think the substance theory can help us to understand how consciousness is sort of deeper in than the third person spatial reality.
That's exciting. I mean, yeah, that's really exciting. Your whole book, it describes the challenges. It goes over sort of the lay of the land. We talk about eliminativism and reduction and all these things, and then it builds up to your again solution in quotes, and it's exciting. So to summarize it for the audience's sake and also for my sake, so I can try to synthesize this information, the substance theory would say that you are a conscious substance, right? Simply. So when we're talking about the interaction between physical states and mental states, it's not quite a dualist interaction problem, because what's fundamental is your conscious substance, and it makes sense for these states of your conscious substance to interact with these other states of your conscious substance. So there are physical and mental states, not fundamental substances, but they are aspects of a fundamental substance. So that's how
That's
it
it.
helps with the interaction problem. For construction, I mean, if you're starting from a mindlessness first perspective, then you don't have the right materials to construct conscious elements. But if you start with a mind, from a mind first perspective and a conscious substance, then from those mental materials can you create other mental materials. Then with the binding unification problem, you have these feelings, these senses, your perceptions, your intentions, all these different and distinct aspects, and they are unified in you, in yourself as a conscious substance. And so finally, the identity problem, I mean, all your cells and molecules are replaced. Your mind changes from moment to moment. You look at if I look at a baby picture of myself, it looks very different. We have different properties, and so you might think, oh, it's different from me, and so we can't be identical. But we're not just talking about bodies. We're not just talking about psychological states, because I am a substance, and that dude is the same substance as me. And the substance, the simple substance, is constant throughout time and throughout psychophysical changes. And that's how the substance theory can account for our existence as conscious selves. Is that all right? Anything you want to
That's
correct?
beautiful. Absolutely, completely beautiful. Yeah, thank you for that summary. That's right. You got it.
Thank you. And you go even deeper. And when we in the final chapter, you talk about our ultimate origin, and you have what you call the source substance theory. And throughout the book, your goal has been to explore and defend a mind first ontology. You're not just trying to argue against materialism, right? Because there could be a mind first view of the world that's consistent with a view you could call materialism. In
That's it.
fact, you propose the mindful matter account, according to which all aspects of physical reality are analyzable in terms of informational mental states. And honestly, this is one of the these are some of the most difficult conclusions for me to accept. It's just hard to wrap my mind around this. Like, if perception is a window into reality, then how is that reality beyond us observer dependent? Uh, I'm just. Could you help me? Could you shed light on this for me?
Yeah. So I think about like in a dream, right? You're aware of contents of consciousness in your dream. Let's say you're dreaming of a blue sky. I had this dream while I was writing the book on consciousness. I was thinking a lot about the topic, and I had a dream where it's one of those dreams where I knew I was dreaming, but I was just aware of this experience of blue, and I conjured up like this ball because I wanted to see what can I do in this dream. So I conjured up like a glowing ball, and then I began to like rotate it across the the sky in my dream, right? So I had this experience, and in this experience, you could say that there is a kind of like mental space, with shape and position and color. There's also like feelings that I'm having. All of that's like part of, let's say, my mind, right? Then I wake up and I'm aware that this may sound a bit strange, but if I could just draw this out a bit, I'm aware of categorically similar kinds of things. So shape, color, structure. Um, Now people say, well, you can't just like control, the trees. You can't just like imagine that they roll off the screen. You can't just start flying or whatever. That's true. That seems like a difference in degree of control. So in my dreams, sometimes I've had dreams where I could fly in my dreams. Sometimes I've had dreams where I'm being chased, and I just can't get off the ground. It's like, even when I know I'm dreaming, it's like I'm just having trouble doing it.
Right.
So I have like some control in my dreams, but not total control. And then when I'm awake, it seems like maybe I have like less control, right? I mean, and this goes back to kind of what you're asking earlier about your ability to affect non-local events through consciousness.
Right.
And there are studies that indicate that there's some evidence that you have some control. Um, but it's whether it's no control or some control, it's less control than in your dream.
Right.
But the point is that this difference in control is a difference, I would say, in degree. It's not a difference in the category of contents of consciousness. And so this opens up the question like, well, what is the nature of the external world? Like, what is it really? And one idea, now this isn't really necessary for my mind first theory in the book. And although I kind of hint at it in some places, you talked about mindful matter and informational matter. I've been developing this idea more even since writing the book. And I think I've maybe become even like more convinced of it, if I could just be
Mm-hmm.
bold about it. And it's the idea that there are these structures in reality that facilitate certain conscious experiences. Okay. And some of these structures in reality facilitate joint conscious experiences. So, I mean, an obvious example would be if we make our own structures, like we make multiplayer video games and we come into those, we play them. And the game comes out of a certain structure of reality that we created in terms of code and hardware and software, and all that works together so we can join in a certain kind of experience, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that the external world is a simulation. I'm not suggesting that it's not either. What I want to say is kind of more neutral. It's that there's a structure within reality that facilitates certain conscious experiences that are more shared with each other than like in a private dream, and more and less controllable than in a private dream. Um, but that fundamentally what's happening is that consciousness and conscious experiences are the primary realities, and that there are these structures within reality that facilitate different experiences. So literally, when you look out and you see a blue sky out there, you're actually having an experience of contents within your consciousness that is similar to an experience that I can have when I look out and see that sky, because there are some common structures that are facilitating some common experiences for us, which allow certain kinds of relationships in this external world. When you die, I don't think what happens is that your spirit gets relocated. I think what happens more fundamentally than that is that the structure in reality that's facilitating your experience changes. So you have a change of experience. And that experience might be sort of metaphorically showing up as going through a tunnel of light or something like this to kind of give you an understanding of what's happening in ways you can understand it. Um, but actually, like, more fundamentally, you are just changing your experience into a new state. So when you wake up, you change your experience. When you up from a dream, you change your experience. When you pass along from this life to the next, I think it's kind of like waking up. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it's not the same as waking up, but it's kind of like waking up to a new experience. And so that's kind of how I would think about it. Like, the external world really is itself based fundamentally on people having experiences facilitated by these structures within reality. I call these algorithms for consciousness, that are themselves created ultimately by conscious beings over time.
So many fascinating things there. I'm trying to understand your view of the objectivity of the external world, and at the risk of using a cliche question, if a tree falls in the forest and no one hears the sound, did it really happen at all? Because you talk about veridical perception, so you're not saying, you know, you're not saying what you perceive um, doesn't exist, but you say veridical perception is mind dependent, and so
Yeah.
how does that make sense? What is the nature of the external world to us, or the
Yeah.
relationship of the external world to us?
So I'm tempted to be modest and then to be bold. So in the book, I try to be modest and kind of neutral. So I give sort of some different options, and I give this window theory of awareness of the external world. And I suggest that there might be some elements in the external world that don't depend on your awareness of them. So if the tree falls in the forest, maybe it makes a sound. Maybe it has colors. Maybe it has a shape, even if there's nobody there to be aware of it. And um, that would be consistent with this sort of broad mind first theory, because the broad mind first theory would just say that everything that exists ultimately comes out of mind, but doesn't mean that it needs a conscious being to be consciously aware of it for it to continue to exist, if
Okay.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that would be like the broad mind first theory is like the fundamental reality has consciousness and it produces the rest of reality. But again, the rest of reality doesn't have to be within consciousness for it to exist, right? But now I'm going to give you my actual view. So this is like my bold view that's not required for my main thesis. But
Okay.
then might as well just stick my neck out there and just tell you this is my working hypothesis. Okay, I could be wrong, but I've been influenced by Donald Hoffman's work in his book, The Case Against Reality. He comes at this from a scientific perspective, and as I was like thinking more about it, and also going deeper into the philosophical literature, some things just started clicking in my mind where it's like, oh, this actually gives a more parsimonious view. This actually makes a lot of sense. And it does actually make sense of some of the recent science that Donald Hoffman's talking about. Now, the science kind of, it's not my area of expertise, so I'm sort of leaning on others. And then I'm leaning on my own area of providing that more fundamental analysis. So here's my view. To answer the question about the tree, if a tree falls in a forest and no one's there to experience it, my answer is not only doesn't it make a sound, it doesn't have a shape, it doesn't have a size, and the tree doesn't even exist. Okay, that is my answer. so this
Wow.
fits actually really really well. I know I know how that sounds, but I think that when the physicists are talking about, I always talk about Carlo Rovelli because he represents in my mind this kind of movement in physics where the understanding that they're talking about is that space itself, that projection of like extension and position, all of that has a deeper explanation in terms of something that's not spatial. And what Carlo Rovelli says is just so fascinating to me because he says the things don't even really, the matter itself doesn't really exist in its own right. It exists in relation to something. And now, what is the something, right? Because it gets a little bit tricky. Is it observers? What is this? Bernardo Kastrup, a philosopher of mine, he asks this question like, is it relations all the way down? Or, what are the relata? What are the things that matter is related to in order for it to exist? And he fills it in the way that Donald Hoffman fills it in. He thinks we can get a more parsimonious account of the material world. Okay. We get a more parsimonious analysis of what matter is fundamentally if what it is it exists in relation to consciousness. And part of the strategy here is to explain the known in terms of the known. So if it's already known that there is consciousness, there's already a problem with generating consciousness out of unconsciousness. So you flip the picture to consciousness as primary, consciousness is
Mm.
first in the picture. Then once you have that, now you can understand what the scientists are saying about non-locality, non-intrinsicality, non the not even spatiality of the fundamental nature of matter and its relational aspect. That is to say, it doesn't sort of exist in its own right, but exists in relation to something. Well, what is that something? Um, so I give an informational theory of matter that seems to fit the what the scientists are saying, but more fundamentally, you kind of like roll all that away. Maybe that's outside my expertise. You should kind of roll that all away. My view in the broad strokes would be that we're having conscious experiences, and those conscious experiences give us, when we're awake, certain common experiences that are shared, because there are some algorithms for generating some shared experiences, and those algorithms are facilitating the experience of a tree. So if there's a tree that falls, if we go to that tree, we'll see that it's there. But if we leave the tree, we're not looking at it. um, the algorithms are still there to generate the tree, but the tree as we understand it in our consciousness, having shape, having form, that doesn't actually exist there on its own. That the fundamental nature of matter itself is a projection out of consciousness. And I want to just be so careful here. I'm not saying that matter is not real, or it's not substantial, or that it's not like independent of my control, or there aren't actual laws to it. It is very real. But I mean, look, consciousness is very real. I mean, if you have a feeling of pain or the feeling of solidity, those are very real experiences within consciousness. It's very real. And I think the temptation, to be honest, to think that a mind first vision of reality is making the material world like not real or less real. I think that kind of comes from part of the impression here. I think comes from thinking of consciousness as not really real or less real. It's like it's just in your mind, therefore it's not really real. And I think if I've been learning anything in the last few years, it's just flipping that whole picture around, just like, oh, consciousness is like more important, more fundamental. If I could use the word real here as kind of code for fundamental, like more fundamental in every aspect of life than I had understood. Even in terms of like mental health, we talked about, like there's ways of experiencing the world that I have control over through intention. And then it even goes to like the entire material world itself depends on consciousness. Okay. That doesn't mean the material world is not real. It means that consciousness is really real. It's really important. It's really foundational. And the material world is actually less foundational than the conscious world. So that is kind of my more, let's say, radical view that I've come to ever so tentatively, slowly. I remember when I first kind of heard of this idea that the things don't exist without consciousness. The tree doesn't exist without some sort of consciousness. I just thought it was interesting, but I didn't believe it. This was in graduate school, and it's only in the last 2 or 3 years, actually, and then maybe even increasingly in the last year, that I've just like, okay, I think this is more than a working hypothesis now. I think this is my view, my current view.
Wow.
But I'd still say this sort of tentatively because
No, yeah, I get it.
um, yeah, there's kind of a lot to explore and think about, and I keep kind of turning it over. Well, do I need this or do I need that? But yeah,
That's so cool. I don't know enough about the scientific literature or about how to really make that view intelligible to me, to affirm it, but I have
yeah,
greater clarity on your own view, and so I really appreciate that. My,
yeah.
my
Thank you.
final main question is probably a very different, hopefully a very different question than you've been asked on other on other channels or whatever. But in your book, I think chapter 1 or 2, you quote the Buddha, right? He says, "Mind precedes mental states," and that's a view that features in your own view. But you don't really interact with Eastern philosophical traditions, and so maybe now could be an opportunity. I can give you that opportunity. So, in a Buddhist framework, persons are analyzable in terms of 5 skandhas, or piles of phenomena. There's the physical or bodily form. There's the sensory, sort of your own experiences. There's the perceptual, such as your sight. There's the dispositional. That's sort of a pre-conscious mental formations and inclinations and affections. And then there's the conscious, and in the Sanskrit term that's translated conscious could be seen as like awareness enabling knowledge. So again, physical, sensory, perceptual, preconscious or dispositional, and then awareness enabling knowledge. Now, the self is only conventionally real because it is a composite of these skandhas. And according to Buddhism, composite objects don't exist, right? It's mereological nihilism. So,
Hmm.
and Buddhist tradition draws this out by saying the self is not identical to its body or its dispositions, but it's also not different from them. Because if you get rid of your bodily form and your perceptions and your consciousness, then you get rid of you as a self. So you're neither identical to it nor different from it. And you don't have it's not just that you have a body or a mind either, because then you run into supervenience issues. And so they say because of all the problems with seeing the relationship between yourself and the piles of which it's comprised, the self is not ultimately real. It's a real convention and a useful illusion, but the concept is ultimately empty. So Buddhists are eliminativists about selves. And moreover, since all is impermanent and change is constant, you don't maintain your identity throughout time. Rather, you, Dr. Rasmussen, are a stream of momentary states with the name Joshua Rasmussen attached to it. Everything
Yeah.
is dependent. Even the external world, like you were saying, is dependent upon computational input. And so it's
Yeah.
so interesting to see how this perspective, how this framework compares and contrasts with your views, your prior identity hypothesis, your substance theory. So I know I said a lot. I can repeat anything you need, but what
Yeah.
are your thoughts on this Buddhist framework?
I love this question, and I've been thinking about this recently. And one of the things I tend to think about is there a kind of synthesis here so that my view can sort of actually encompass this view or a certain interpretation of this view? So I've talked with some people who know more about sort of the Buddhist tradition than I do, and some of the no self views. And one distinction that comes up is a distinction between like your egoic self, which includes your kind of personality profile, maybe your form of existence, and then the sort of like deeper, pure, contentless consciousness. Okay,
Right.
um, maybe I might want to use the word deep self. You know, like there's a deep self and then there's an egoic self. And see, I don't know if the arguments there, I mean, go back to the sort of piles of consciousness there. It's like, well, that fits very well with my view because um, I don't think that I'm any particular psychological state, and nor do I think that I'm a combination of those psychological states, except I will grant that there's an ego self, like a Josh Rasmussen character. Sometimes my wife and I will talk about the Josh Rasmussen character, what he's been doing, and I'll disassociate, well, yeah, I don't like what that Josh Rasmussen character did either. I'm so sorry, that he did that. I guess I did that through him, right? But that's not really me, Rachel. So the point here is that there's maybe a difference between like who you are, like most fundamentally, and then these sort of egoic associations of who you are. And I've wondered if maybe the depth of our association with the egoic descriptions are so great that in the sort of first iteration for humanity to discover who we are on a deeper level, we first come to realize that we don't even exist, right? Because
Mhm.
what we thought we were is so tied up with these sort of egoic forms that once we realize that what we actually are couldn't be that, then we say then we don't exist. It's like the no self view. Um, but what if actually who we are is something so deeper, so fundamental that we might not even recognize it as self. If I use the word self, might not recognize it because again, associating ourselves with our ego so much. Um, so that's one sort of consideration, and it's definitely an area for me to look more into. I've been wondering if um, kind of what I mean by deep self, like who I really am at the most fundamental level, is something that would be compatible with what some of these no self theorists have been suggesting.
Hmm.
And maybe the answer could be yes and no. Like could be yes on some interpretations, and then no on other interpretations. But that's my attempt at synthesis. Because I think instead of sort of arguing against the no self view, I want to try to understand it better and see if
Mm.
there's a way of synthesizing it.
I respect that, and of course there are different um, schools of thought within Buddhism, right? So
Yeah,
Yogacara Buddhism has more of an emphasis on phenomenology. It could even be characterized as idealist in a sense. Um, and hold on, I lost my train of thought for a second. Oh, one difference between your substance theory and at least most interpretations of the Anatman doctrine or no self doctrine is that you, it was so cool when I read your prior identity hypothesis, right?
yeah,
And so you don't see the self as a composite object, as an aggregate of, your body and your thoughts and your dispositions. You see the self or the substance that is yourself as prior to all those, right? And so how the Buddha has said in the Pali Canon that the mind precedes thoughts, that is, thoughts don't make up your mind, the mind is prior. You would say, well, your mind and your body and your feelings don't make up the self.
that's
The
right.
self is substantially existent and prior to those aspects of the self. And so that would be a potentially interesting point of disagreement, but not any sort of tribalistic disagreement, because there's
Yeah,
so
right.
much overlap and so much room to understand more.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it does seem like if there is a foundational layer of reality, whatever it is, that reality is going to be prior to the particular forms that it
Right.
takes. And that connects up, I think, very well with maybe a conclusion that I draw out in the book, which is that what you are most fundamentally is connected so intimately to the foundational stuff of existence
Mm.
that you aren't really just created ex nihilo from nothing, but you're more formed out of the fundamental stuff. And I mean, this is kind of my working hypothesis for like how you could be made. You're made out of that most fundamental stuff, and so yeah, I mean, there's certainly more to be done here in terms of exploring possible overlaps, and I will appreciate looking more into literature that you've been looking at because others have been sending me literature as well on this, and just to kind of really tease out those different interpretations, I think can lead to progress on this topic.
Absolutely. Um, Another thing is when we're explaining conscious aspects in terms of a conscious substance, how is that not circular, right? So this is just a genuine question for me.
Yeah.
If we're trying to understand the emergence of consciousness and we say it emerges from a conscious substance, well, you're using the word conscious in your account of consciousness. So maybe I'm just misunderstanding, but could you help me to understand better?
Yeah, no, this is absolutely a great question. So on one level, it is just circular. Okay, so, um, but the way that I try to give a deeper insight into the concept without circularity is in my chapter on the self. This is where I talk about the three different arrows, and what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get the reader into a state of just pure self awareness, where you're aware of yourself having thoughts and feelings. And the idea that I have is that that kind of self awareness gives you insight into what this substance is. Um, so you don't have to just know it by description. The substance by description is that which has your consciousness. But then through self awareness, you're aware of that which has your consciousness. You know
Mm.
what it is. At least that's my claim. I mean, and that might be sort of a way of pushing back at no self views interpreted in a way that would contradict my view. Um, is just to say, but I think there is something that you can be directly consciously aware of in self awareness. It's just that that which you're consciously aware of is not a kind of egoic personality or some of your
Right.
traits. It's deeper, and it is literally like that which just is you. Okay, so
Mm.
that's as like deep as I can go. I mean, it's hard to really analyze that further because it's the foundation for the analysis of everything else.
Right. Yeah. At some point, you have to come to an explanatory ultimate, And
Yeah,
when you can't keep asking why. At some point, it's just that's how it is. Um,
yeah,
all right. So
exactly.
as the brief conclusion to every video, I ask my guests the three more personal questions. The first is just what's something on which you've changed your mind? It could be from study, from conversations, from experience, just anything.
Yeah, thank you for this. So, probably just from writing this book, one thing that I changed my mind on is about mental causation. So, I think
Hmm.
be, before I wrote this book, I sort of thought of the mind as gaining certain powers to influence the world, um, kind of because of a brain that was maybe created or whatever came about through different processes. Um, and so people talk about top down causation, where like the whole has powers over the parts. I think that's kind of the view that I used to have, that like once you come to exist, you have sort of powers over your parts. But in the course of writing the book, I mean, I kind of began to shift towards this more, you might call it an idealistic framework, where, and it's not just that God's mind is the mind that upholds all of reality. It's that your consciousness actually is foundational the to the material effects in the world. So you are deeper in. I think that that's been the mind change for me, is just seeing how I've come to think that you as a conscious being are deeper in to reality. It's not just that there's some consciousness is foundational, that your consciousness is prior to my all of your mindless material experience, your experiences of mindless material states. You are deeper in. So that would be something I've changed my mind on kind of recently.
Thank you for that. And another thing is, what are some more personal factors that influence your worldview? So, considerations that don't necessarily constitute propositional evidence, but things that affect how you see the world.
It's all propositional for me. No, I'm just kidding. I'd say my relationship with my wife definitely has a lot of effect for me and my children. Just seeing my children, like how they interact, experiencing them on emotional levels, connecting with my wife, and it's not just our conversations; it's like experiencing a kind of relationship with her that gives me data to think about. Experiencing my kids, has given me data to think about, like the problem of evil, and thinking about my love for my children, and what I would, yeah, like, what I would do to protect them, and those sorts of things. It's definitely like affected my worldview just through my relationships. And so I have this statement: experience unlocks meaning. And so I think the experience of relationships of various kinds has helped us sort of unlock an understanding of things that I don't think could be possible without those experiences in some form.
All right. And so finally, do you have any final thoughts, any advice for me or our audience, any further recommendations that you'd point us to?
I love what you're doing on this channel. And I was telling you before the show, just I'm so impressed. Like, I feel like you have something so special because you have this kind of like inner fire and a sense of greatness, I think, that out into interesting forms that carry messages. And so you've got your music side, you've got the philosophy side. I don't think of these as like different aspects of you. I mean, they are, but they're very unified by this kind of brilliance to produce something awesome that carries messages and invites people to become curious. And I would say that actually leads me to my final thought, which is the message of the book, which is that you are more profound. You are more deeply rooted into reality, than I think human beings have understood. And I anticipate we're going to have, through new breakthroughs in technology and new um, findings in science, that is going will continue to reveal this profound result more and more. I anticipate, and we'll see, that there are going to be some category shifting, dramatic kind of developments in science and technology that's going to highlight from new angles the depths the depths of us. It's not that everybody's going to change their view fundamentally. It's that there's going to be a greater understanding of just how great we are in the world, and that our greatness really is a testament to the greatness of the fundamental nature of reality. We are rooted all the way down into the foundations. So that would be my take home thought, my take home message. And kind of along with that, to be curious, to look within, to use the introspective light, to follow the light kind of where it leads you. And I think you're going to find more and more treasures by your own lights than I could ever give you. I think that's the power that everybody has, is to see more.
Well, that serves as a beautiful outro. So, with that, I want to thank you. I want to thank our audience. Hopefully, you've been challenged and educated. And to everyone, peace.